I am Tessa, 29 years old, and somehow still paying the price for being the only responsible person in my family. Last night, 8 of us were gathered in my parents' lavish living room for what was supposed to be a standard family meeting. My mother, Valerie, sat on the velvet sofa swirling her wine glass and grinning about our upcoming family vacation to Florida. I was just about to ask what time our flight was when my father, Desmond, stood up and pointed a rigid finger at me. "You are not coming with us, Tessa, so stop packing. You are staying right here to babysit Grandpa Elijah because his dementia is getting worse and he cannot fly." I sat there in stunned silence as my sister Sienna and her husband Liam exchanged a victorious smirk. I simply nodded and accepted my fate. But when I bent down to pick up my grandfather's dropped cane, he grabbed my wrist with a grip like iron. His eyes were perfectly clear when he whispered to me to let them go because Liam is going to walk right into a trap. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family who underestimated your worth and tried to use you. The sheer shock of my grandfather's lucid voice sent a jolt of electricity down my spine. I kept my face completely blank, slowly pulling my hand away and sitting back up. My father was still standing by the fireplace looking at me with that familiar expression of absolute disdain. He adjusted his expensive silk tie, a tie I knew for a fact was bought on a credit card he had maxed out 3 months ago. He told me that someone had to be the responsible one, and since I was the only single woman in the room with no real life, it made perfect sense for me to do my duty. That was when Liam decided to chime in. Liam is my sister's husband, a white crypto investor who moved into our family orbit 2 years ago and immediately started acting like he owned the place. He leaned back in his leather armchair, crossing his legs and chuckling loudly. Liam looked right at me and said I should stop looking so miserable. He said I was used to staying behind and doing the heavy lifting anyway. Liam reminded everyone in the room that my parents had graciously put a roof over my head for 18 years, so the least I could do was change a few of the old man's diapers while the rest of them enjoyed the beach. My blood boiled instantly. The sheer audacity of this man lecturing me about family duty was mind-boggling. I looked at Liam and then at my sister Sienna. Sienna was busy inspecting her freshly manicured nails, completely ignoring the insult her husband just hurled at me. They loved to rewrite history. Liam did not seem to remember that I paid for every single cent of my own college tuition by working double shifts at a diner. I took out massive student loans and paid them off myself by working grueling hours as a forensic accountant. Meanwhile, Sienna had her entire tuition paid in full by my parents, who also bought her a brand new luxury vehicle for her graduation. When Liam made some bad trades last year and lost $50,000, my parents quietly bailed him out. Yet here he was treating me like the family servant. I took a deep breath and looked directly at my father. I asked him if this was a family vacation or an exclusive trip for the Golden children. I pointed out that I had already requested the time off from my firm and contributed $3,000 to the shared vacation fund we set up last month. My mother, Valerie, scoffed loudly from the sofa. She waved her hand dismissively and said I was being dramatic as always. She claimed my money went toward the non-refundable deposit for the beachfront villa, so I would not be getting it back. She told me to consider it my contribution to my grandfather's care fund. They were literally stealing my money to fund their luxury trip while trapping me at home. I looked at the 8 people in that room, my parents, my sister, her arrogant husband, and a few aunts and uncles who just stared at the floor, avoiding my gaze. Not a single person spoke up to defend me. They were all complicit. They all benefited from me being the designated scapegoat. I felt a familiar burning sensation in my chest, but I forced myself to remain perfectly calm. Working as a forensic accountant teaches you one very important lesson. Never show your suspect that you are onto them. Liam smirked again and took a sip of his bourbon. He told me to cheer up and promised to bring me back a cheap souvenir from Miami. He said something about how the Florida trip was actually a crucial networking opportunity for his new business venture, and he needed a stress-free environment. I knew Liam was lying. His crypto business was a spectacular failure, and his bank accounts were bleeding dry. I had seen the foreclosure notices he carelessly left in the trash can last month. Yet here he was pretending to be a high-rolling entrepreneur. Beside me, Grandpa Elijah let out a loud, confused moan, perfectly playing the part of a man losing his mind. He knocked his teacup off the side table, letting it shatter on the hardwood floor. My mother shrieked and complained about the mess. My father rolled his eyes and muttered something about how exhausting it was to be around an old man who belonged in a nursing home. I immediately dropped to my knees to clean up the spilled tea and broken porcelain. As I gathered the broken pieces, Grandpa Elijah leaned forward. He made it look like he was just losing his balance, but his mouth was right next to my ear. His voice was sharper and colder than I had ever heard it. He told me to play along and let them take the flight tomorrow morning. He whispered that the resort deed they think they are taking to Florida is completely fake. He told me to come down to the locked basement the moment their plane takes off because it was time to burn their entire house of cards to the ground. I stood up, holding the broken pieces of the teacup. I looked at my family celebrating their stolen vacation. They thought they had outsmarted me. They thought they had trapped a helpless old man and his boring accountant granddaughter, but they had absolutely no idea that they were boarding a flight straight into a federal financial crime. I smiled warmly at my father and told him to have a wonderful time in Florida. I said I would take excellent care of Grandpa Elijah. The rest of the evening dragged on with agonizing slowness. I cleared the heavy porcelain plates and crystal wine glasses from the long mahogany dining table while my family moved to the adjacent living room. They gathered around the massive flat-screen television, looking at virtual tours of the luxurious beachfront villa they had booked with my hard-earned money. My sister Sienna was already complaining about the humidity in southern Florida and demanding that her husband Liam book her a private poolside cabana for the entire week. I wiped down the granite countertops in the kitchen, listening to their loud laughter echoing through the wide hallway. It was a harsh reminder of how easily they could erase my existence the moment I was no longer useful to their perfect image. Every time I walked past the living room to carry another heavy tray of dirty dishes, my father Desmond would look right through me, as if I was nothing more than part of the hired help. I made sure to keep my expression completely neutral and submissive. I washed the expensive dishes by hand, letting the warm, soapy water run over my tired fingers, while my mind raced with what my grandfather had just whispered to me. As I finished drying the last of the heavy silver forks, my mother Valerie strutted into the kitchen. She was wearing her expensive designer silk pajamas and carrying her empty wine glass. She placed the delicate crystal glass on the counter and leaned against the marble island, crossing her arms over her chest. Valerie looked me up and down with that familiar condescending smirk she reserved only for me. She told me I needed to make sure the kitchen was absolutely spotless before I went to bed because she did not want to come back from her luxury vacation to a filthy house. I simply nodded and continued drying the silverware. Then she stepped closer, lowering her voice into a tone that was dripping with fake maternal sympathy. She told me she knew I was disappointed about missing the family trip, but that I really needed to start looking at the bigger picture of my life. She said that at my age, being single and overly obsessed with my corporate accounting career, I needed to learn the true value of family sacrifice. Valerie actually had the nerve to tell me that taking care of Grandpa Elijah was a blessing in disguise because it would give me quiet time to reflect on my selfish and isolated life choices. She reminded me to pick up his expensive heart medication from the pharmacy tomorrow morning and explicitly told me to use my own debit card because their joint accounts would be completely tied up with vacation expenses. I looked right into her cold eyes and calmly agreed to do it. I did not argue or try to defend my dignity. I just let her bask in her false sense of superiority. She patted my cheek exactly like one would pet a stray street dog and walked out of the kitchen humming a cheerful classical tune. I turned off the bright kitchen lights and walked down the long dark hallway toward my bedroom. As I passed the grand wooden staircase, I heard a hushed, frantic voice coming from my father's private study. The heavy oak door was slightly ajar, and a thin sliver of yellow light spilled out onto the polished hardwood floor. I stopped walking immediately and pressed my back flat against the cold hallway wall. I peeked through the narrow crack and saw Liam pacing back and forth across the expensive Persian rug. He was holding his smartphone tightly against his ear and running his free hand nervously through his blonde hair. His face was pale, and he was sweating profusely despite the cool air conditioning humming in the large house. I strained my ears to listen to his side of the intense conversation. Liam was speaking in a panicked whisper, telling the person on the other end of the line that they needed to buy him just 3 more days to secure the bridge financing. He kept repeating frantically that the real estate collateral was completely secured and that he would absolutely have the final legal signatures by Tuesday afternoon. He told the aggressive caller that the Florida trip was the final piece of the puzzle and that the old man was way too senile to know what was happening with his own properties. I watched closely as Liam aggressively ended the call and leaned heavily over the thick wooden desk, breathing like a man drowning. He pulled a thick manila folder from his expensive leather briefcase and quickly flipped through the dense legal pages. Even from a distance, my trained forensic accountant eyes easily recognized the standard formatting of a commercial real estate transfer deed. He shoved the folder violently back into his bag, looking over his shoulder like a trapped animal sensing a predator. My heart pounded fiercely against my ribs, but I forced myself to stay absolutely silent and still. Liam was not just a failing crypto investor with bad luck. He was a truly desperate man swimming in incredibly dangerous criminal waters. I crept away from the study door and silently made my way to my small bedroom at the end of the hall. I sat on the edge of my mattress, fully dressed, staring intently at the glowing red numbers of the digital clock on my nightstand. I waited for hours in the dark until the sprawling suburban house fell into complete and total silence. I listened to the faint sound of my father snoring loudly upstairs, and the occasional low hum of the central heating unit kicking on. When the clock finally struck 2 in the morning, I slowly stood up. I slipped off my shoes and walked barefoot down the dark hallway, carefully avoiding the specific floorboards I knew would creak and give me away. I finally reached the heavy wooden door that led down to the basement. My parents strictly forbade anyone from ever going down there, claiming it was structurally unsafe and filled with dangerous old junk. But I knew the real truth. It was Grandpa Elijah's personal hidden sanctuary. A secure place where he kept decades of sensitive business records from his massive real estate empire. I reached deep into the pocket of my knitted cardigan and pulled out the small brass key he had secretly slipped into my hand earlier that evening, when I was kneeling on the floor cleaning up his deliberately broken teacup. I slid the cold metal key into the brass lock and turned it with a very soft click. I pulled the heavy door open and slowly descended the wooden stairs into the total darkness. The cool air down here smelled comforting, like old paper and strong cedar wood. When my bare feet reached the bottom concrete step, a single bright desk lamp suddenly flickered on in the far back corner of the large room. Sitting calmly behind a massive metal industrial desk was my grandfather. He was not slouched over or looking confused. He sat perfectly upright, his sharp dark eyes glowing with a fierce and highly calculating intensity. He wore a crisp white dress shirt and had a massive stack of confidential financial documents neatly arranged in perfect piles in front of him. There was absolutely no trace of the helpless and dying old man my parents and sister loved to constantly mock and belittle. He pointed a steady finger to the empty metal folding chair positioned directly across from him and softly told me to sit down. I walked over and took my seat, feeling a strange but powerful mix of deep relief and thrilling anticipation. He looked at me with a proud, knowing smile and said we had a lot of forensic accounting work to do before the sun came up and their plane took off. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the cold metal desk, completely ready to uncover every single devastating lie my terrible family had buried in the dark. I looked at the man who was supposed to be losing his mind and realized he was sharper than anyone else in the house. Grandpa Elijah pushed a thick stack of manila envelopes across the cold metal desk. He told me he started faking his cognitive decline about 8 months ago when he first noticed money quietly disappearing from his minor investment accounts. He knew his son Desmond was greedy, but he needed to see exactly how far my parents would go when they thought nobody was watching. He said the results were worse than he ever imagined. I opened the first envelope and pulled out a stack of bank statements printed on crisp white paper. As a forensic accountant, I look at financial documents all day long, but these numbers made my stomach drop. My parents' entire glamorous lifestyle was a complete and utter fabrication. The luxury cars in this driveway were heavily leased with missed payments piling up. The exclusive country club membership my mother loved to brag about had been suspended for non-payment over a year ago. Even the designer clothes my sister Sienna flaunted on social media were bought on high-interest credit cards that were completely maxed out. I traced my finger down the columns of red numbers, feeling a sickening mixture of anger and validation. They had treated me like garbage for years because I lived a modest life and saved my money, while they played the role of wealthy socialites on a stage built entirely of debt. Then Grandpa Elijah handed me a separate black folder. He told me to look very closely at the recent cash deposits. I opened the folder and saw a series of massive wire transfers totaling exactly $2 million. I asked him which bank approved such a ridiculous loan for people with completely ruined credit scores. He looked at me with cold, dark eyes and said it was not a bank. The money came from a private lending syndicate operating out of a shell company in the Cayman Islands. These were not the kind of people who send polite collection letters when you miss a payment. They were loan sharks who dealt in physical threats and total asset seizure. My father Desmond and my mother Valerie had mortgaged their actual lives to maintain an illusion of extreme wealth. They had borrowed $2 million of dirty money just to keep throwing lavish parties and funding Sienna's ridiculous shopping sprees. Grandpa Elijah leaned back in his chair, folding his hands over his stomach. He said my parents were currently drowning in interest payments they could never afford to make. The loan sharks were demanding their money back, and my father was completely out of options. That is when Liam, the golden son-in-law, stepped in with his brilliant plan. I grabbed a fresh legal pad and a pen from the desk. I started doing what I do best, analyzing the flow of the illicit cash. The numbers painted a terrifying picture. Out of the $2 million they borrowed, almost half of it went straight into Liam's failing cryptocurrency business. My parents literally handed $1 million of borrowed mob money to an arrogant amateur investor, hoping he would double it and save the family. Instead, Liam lost every single penny in a series of disastrous trades within 3 weeks. The rest of the money was blown on my parents' ridiculous facade, including the non-refundable deposit for the Florida villa they were flying to tomorrow morning. I stared at the legal pad, shaking my head in disbelief. They were actively celebrating a vacation funded by dangerous criminals who were probably already tracking their every move. Grandpa Elijah watched me process the information. He said he had built his real estate empire from nothing, fighting tooth and nail against a world that constantly tried to keep a black man down. He wanted to leave a legacy of generational wealth for his family, but his own son had turned it into a toxic swamp of greed and stupidity. He told me he was deeply ashamed of Desmond, but he was incredibly proud of me. He said I was the only one who inherited his work ethic and his respect for the truth. I felt a hard lump form in my throat. For my entire life, I was the family scapegoat. I was the boring one, the ugly duckling, the ungrateful daughter who never quite fit into their picture-perfect aesthetic. But sitting in that dimly lit basement, looking at the undeniable proof of their moral and financial bankruptcy, I finally realized I was the only successful person in the entire house. I asked my grandfather what Liam's specific role was in the Florida trip. If the money was already gone and the loan sharks were closing in, why were they going to a luxury beach resort? Grandpa Elijah slid one final document across the table. It was a poorly fabricated copy of a master property deed. He pointed to the signature line. He explained that Liam convinced my desperate father, that the only way to pay back the $2 million and save their lives was to quickly liquidate a massive asset. Since they owned absolutely nothing of value, they decided to steal the biggest asset in the family portfolio. They were targeting my grandfather's prized possession, a sprawling beachfront commercial resort in Miami, worth over $15 million. Liam had set up a private meeting with a shady buyer in Florida who was willing to pay cash fast, no questions asked. I studied the forged signature on the fake deed, the pieces of the puzzle slammed together in my mind. They needed my grandfather out of the way, but they could not leave him alone because someone might realize he was not actually senile. They needed a reliable, gullible babysitter to keep him locked in the house while they executed the biggest financial crime of their lives across the country. They chose me because they thought I was too weak and too obedient to ever question their authority. I opened my encrypted laptop and began entering the routing numbers from the Cayman Island Shell Company. I needed to build an ironclad paper trail proving that Liam and my parents were the sole beneficiaries of the illegal funds. I worked in total silence, the only sound in the basement being the rapid clicking of my keyboard. Grandpa Elijah handed me a cup of black coffee he had brewed in the corner. I found the exact moment Liam transferred the mob money into his unregulated crypto exchange. I saved every single file to a secure cloud drive, creating a digital vault of evidence that would soon destroy their entire fake reality. I looked up from the screen and met my grandfather's fierce gaze. The sadness in the room was completely gone, replaced by a sharp, burning desire for absolute justice. I asked him exactly how we were going to stop them. He smiled a dangerous, calculated smile and told me we were not going to stop them at all. He said we were going to let them fly down to Florida and sit in that fancy boardroom. We were going to let them dig their own graves so deep that they would never be able to climb out. He told me to keep typing because we had to draft a few legal surprises of our own before the sun came up. We worked through the remaining hours of the night in the quiet basement. Grandpa Elijah showed me the exact digital copy of the forged power of attorney Liam had quietly slipped into the family legal files. It was a sloppy piece of work, but just official enough to fool a desperate buyer. Liam actually believed that a simple notarized piece of paper he bought off a corrupt strip mall lawyer would give him the ultimate authority to liquidate a $15 million commercial resort. He planned a massive fire sale offering the prime coastal property to a shadow corporation for a fraction of its true value, just to get the cash fast enough to satisfy his loan sharks. Grandpa explained that the buyer was highly likely a front for the exact same criminals who loaned them the $2 million in the first place. They were going to steal the valuable property and still hold the massive debt over my father's head. It was a complete bloodbath of financial incompetence and arrogant stupidity. When the sun finally began to rise, painting the suburban sky in pale pinks and soft oranges, I closed my encrypted laptop. The digital trap was fully set, and all we had to do now was wait for them to walk right into it. A few hours later, the quiet house erupted into chaotic and selfish noise. I walked upstairs and stood quietly by the front door, watching my family drag their expensive designer luggage down the grand wooden staircase. My mother, Valerie, was wearing a ridiculous oversized sun hat and massive dark sunglasses, acting like she was an A-list celebrity trying to avoid the paparazzi. She tossed her heavy leather carry-on bag toward me without even looking in my direction, fully expecting me to catch it like an obedient bellhop. My father, Desmond, checked his heavy gold watch, tapping his expensive leather shoe impatiently against the floorboards as he waited for the private airport shuttle to arrive. He pointed a stern and aggressive finger at me and reminded me that the entire house better be absolutely immaculate when they returned. He told me to keep Grandpa Elijah strictly confined to the first floor because he did not want the crazy old man wandering around and breaking any more expensive items. Then Liam came walking down the stairs. He was wearing a crisp white linen suit and holding his leather briefcase tightly against his chest, like it contained the Holy Grail itself. Inside that briefcase was the forged power of attorney and the fake property deed that he thought would save his miserable life. He gave me a highly condescending wink and told me not to work too hard while they were sipping expensive margaritas on the white sand beach. My sister Sienna did not even bother to say a proper goodbye to me. She was too busy recording a live video on her phone for her followers loudly bragging about her spontaneous luxury getaway and showing off her new designer travel outfit. I stood there by the front door keeping my face perfectly blank and politely wished them all a very safe flight. I watched the black luxury shuttle van pull out of the long driveway and disappear down the quiet suburban street. The moment they were entirely out of sight, the heavy oppressive energy in the house instantly vanished into thin air. Grandpa Elijah walked up behind me, slowly resting his warm hand gently on my shoulder. We did not say a single word to each other. We just turned around and went right back to work. By noon, I was sitting comfortably at the kitchen island reviewing the final trust documents when my phone buzzed violently against the cold marble counter. It was a text message from my mother, Valerie. I opened the long message and felt a sudden cold wave of absolute disgust wash over me. She had sent a demanding paragraph instructing me to immediately drive to a specialized holistic pharmacy, clear across town. She told me to purchase a specific brand of highly expensive imported memory supplements for Grandpa Elijah. She claimed her new holistic doctor had just recommended them and that it was absolutely critical for his rapidly declining brain health. Then came the true emotional gut punch. She casually added that the imported supplements would cost about $3,000, and since she was currently out of state having fun, I would have to cover the entire cost out of my own personal bank account. She promised to pay me back eventually, but told me not to be incredibly stingy when it came to taking care of family. Directly beneath that outrageous and insulting demand was a vibrant photo she had just uploaded from her phone. I tapped the image to make it larger on my screen. It was a high-resolution selfie of my entire family standing on the polished wooden deck of a massive luxury yacht in Miami. The ocean behind them was a brilliant, sparkling turquoise under the bright Florida sun. My father was holding the large bottle of expensive champagne, and Liam was grinning widely with a thick, imported cigar resting in his mouth. They were literally burning through the very last remnants of their borrowed mob money, celebrating the impending theft of my grandfather's massive real estate empire, while simultaneously trying to squeeze another $3,000 out of my personal savings account. The sheer audacity of their behavior was almost too difficult to comprehend. They were treating me like an unlimited ATM machine while they orchestrated a massive federal crime across the country. I looked at the picture of my sister Sienna posing in a designer swimsuit that probably cost more than my monthly car payment. She looked so utterly convinced of her own superiority and untouchable status. She had absolutely no idea that the ground beneath her feet was already crumbling into dust. I did not reply to the text message with any anger or frustration. I did not call my mother to argue about the ridiculous money or demand basic human respect. I simply typed a short, cheerful reply, confirming that I would take care of everything, and wished them a wonderful, relaxing afternoon on the water. I set my phone face down on the counter and took a long, deep breath. Any lingering trace of guilt or hesitation I might have felt about completely destroying my own family evaporated in that exact moment. They had made their final choice. They had decided that my worth was purely transactional and completely disposable. They saw me as nothing more than a convenient financial safety net to catch them when their reckless lies finally caught up to their reality. I picked up the printed copies of the Cayman Island wire transfers and walked back down the wooden stairs to the basement. Grandpa Elijah was already on the phone with his senior legal team, setting up the final strategic pieces of our counter-offensive. I sat down at the cold metal desk and opened Liam's encrypted hard drive one more time. I needed to dig much deeper into his unregulated crypto accounts. I knew that a man as reckless and arrogant as Liam would leave a massive digital trail of breadcrumbs leading straight to his personal banking devices. I was going to make absolutely sure that when the federal agents finally raided that luxury boardroom in Florida, They would have every single piece of evidence they needed to put him away for a very long time. I stared at the glowing screen of my laptop, letting the silence of the basement settle around me. The encrypted hard drive Liam had carelessly left behind in his old home office desk was a goldmine of terrible decisions. As a forensic accountant, I spent my entire professional life hunting down hidden assets and exposing corporate liars. Breaking into Liam's poorly secured digital files was almost insultingly easy. He used my sister Sienna's birth date and their wedding anniversary as his master passwords. It was pathetic. I bypassed his weak firewall in less than 10 minutes and gained full administrative access to his entire digital life. I opened his primary email account and began downloading years of private correspondence. I was looking for the exact mechanism he used to convince those dangerous Cayman Island loan sharks to hand over $2 million to a man with absolutely no legitimate income. The basement was completely quiet, except for the steady hum of the dehumidifier in the corner. Grandpa Elijah sat across from me patiently, sipping a fresh cup of black coffee. He knew better than to interrupt me when I was in the zone. I opened a new spreadsheet and began mapping out the complex web of shell companies and offshore accounts Liam had tried to hide. He had set up a fake limited liability company in Delaware, masking it as a high-yield real estate investment firm. I traced the incoming wire transfers from the Cayman Syndicate directly into this Delaware account. But the loan sharks were not stupid. They never would have fronted that kind of massive cash without rock-solid collateral. I clicked on a folder labeled Secure Assets and my blood ran completely cold. There were dozens of high-resolution scanned documents inside. I opened the first file and saw my grandfather's signature. It was not the clumsy forgery they were taking to Florida today. It was a highly sophisticated digital manipulation of an old commercial lease agreement. Liam had taken my grandfather's legitimate business signature and digitally grafted it onto a massive commercial promissory note. He had explicitly listed my grandfather's $15 million coastal resort as the primary physical collateral for his ridiculous crypto margin loans. Liam was not just trying to sell the property today to pay off the debt. He had already secretly pledged the entire resort to the loan sharks months ago. He used the phantom collateral to artificially inflate his net worth so he could secure the initial $2 million. When his crypto investments completely collapsed and the market tanked, the loan sharks issued a massive margin call. They demanded their money back immediately, or they were going to legally seize the resort, using the fraudulent promissory note Liam had provided. That was the real reason my parents were so incredibly desperate. If the loan sharks seized the property through the courts, the entire family would be publicly exposed and completely ruined. So Liam concocted this ridiculous Florida fire sale plan to beat the loan sharks to the punch. He wanted to sell the resort to a completely different buyer for quick cash, pay off the angry syndicate, and walk away looking like the savior of the family. He was playing a massive game of financial Russian roulette using my grandfather's life work as the bullet. I explained the entire twisted scheme to Grandpa Elijah. He did not look surprised or angry. He just shook his head in deep disappointment. He said Liam was playing a very dangerous game with people who did not care about legal loopholes. I went back to the keyboard and started compiling the ultimate evidence package. I needed this to be a perfect open and shut case for the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I took screenshots of the forged promissory notes, the illegal wire transfers, and the fake Delaware Shell Company registration. I cross-referenced every single document with Liam's personal IP address, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that he was the sole architect of the massive fraud. I even found a folder containing his frantic text messages to his crypto brokers, begging them for more time, and openly admitting that he had falsified the collateral documents. He had literally documented his own federal crimes in writing. Then I found something that made me stop typing. It was a joint bank account statement. My sister Sienna was not just an innocent bystander or a clueless wife spending her husband's money. Her name was listed as the co-signer on the fraudulent Delaware Shell Company. She had personally authorized 3 different wire transfers to luxury car dealerships using the stolen mob money. She knew exactly where the cash was coming from, and she actively participated in laundering it through high-end retail purchases. She was just as guilty as he was. I felt a sharp pang of betrayal, but I quickly pushed it down. Sienna had always treated me like an annoying peasant who existed solely to make her look better. She chose to marry a criminal, and she chose to spend stolen money. Now she was going to face the severe federal consequences of those choices. I packaged the entire digital footprint into a heavily encrypted zip file. This was the exact weapon I was going to use to destroy them. It was no longer just about stopping a bad real estate deal in Miami. It was about surgically dismantling their entire fraudulent existence. I looked at the clock on the wall. It was early afternoon. My parents and Liam were probably checking into their luxury suites right now, drinking expensive champagne and laughing about how incredibly stupid I was for staying behind. They thought they had secured their glamorous future. They did not know I was sitting in a dark basement, holding the exact match that would burn their entire lives to ash. The house was incredibly still after I finished compiling the digital evidence file. I closed my laptop and carried my empty coffee mug up the basement stairs, feeling a strange sense of calm wash over me. The afternoon sun was streaming through the large windows, casting long shadows across the expensive hardwood floors my parents loved to brag about. I walked into the bright kitchen and turned on the faucet to wash the mug when I heard the distinct crunch of heavy tires rolling aggressively onto the gravel driveway. I froze and looked through the large bay window near the sink. A dark gray sedan with heavily tinted windows and no front license plate was parked right in front of the house. A tall, broad-shouldered man in a cheap, wrinkled gray suit stepped out of the vehicle. He looked around nervously, scanning the quiet suburban neighborhood before quickly walking up the front steps. I heard the heavy brass knocker slam against the front door, echoing loudly through the empty hallway. I dried my hands on a dish towel and walked cautiously toward the foyer, my heart beginning to beat a little faster. Before I could even reach the door, I heard the sharp metallic click of a key turning in the deadbolt lock. The heavy wooden door swung open, and the strange man stepped inside, bringing a rush of hot, humid summer air with him. He completely ignored my presence and immediately started walking down the hallway, his heavy boots thudding against the floorboards. He was heading straight toward my grandfather's private study. I stepped directly into his path, blocking his way, and demanding to know who he was and how he got a key to my family home. The man stopped and looked me up and down with a highly disrespectful sneer. He smelled strongly of stale cigarette smoke and cheap cologne. He told me his name was Marcus, and he was a legal associate working directly for my brother-in-law, Liam. He casually explained that Liam had accidentally forgotten some highly important business documents for the Florida real estate closing and sent him over to quickly fetch them. I looked down at the shiny brass key dangling from his thick fingers. Liam had actually given a complete stranger full unrestricted access to our family home while he was thousands of miles away in Miami. It was an unbelievable breach of security and a glaring sign of sheer desperation. I kept my voice completely steady and told Marcus that Liam was highly mistaken because there were absolutely no business documents left in this house. I instructed him to turn around and leave the property immediately before I called the police for trespassing and breaking and entering. Marcus let out a harsh, mocking laugh and took another step forward, invading my personal space. He looked down at me and told me I was just the hired babysitter and I needed to get out of his way before things got unpleasant. He said Liam gave him explicit legal instructions to retrieve a specific thick red folder from the hidden wall safe inside the study, and he was absolutely not leaving this house without it. The sheer arrogance of their backup plan was staggering to witness. Liam must have realized that the forged property deed he took to Miami was completely useless without the original physical deed to back it up. Maybe the shady buyers suddenly demanded to see the authentic watermark before handing over the millions of dollars, or maybe Liam just wanted to destroy the original to cover his tracks entirely. Whatever the real reason, Liam was completely terrified, and he sent this sleazy proxy lawyer to break into my grandfather's secure safe to steal the real document. I crossed my arms tightly over my chest and planted my feet firmly on the hardwood floor, right in front of the heavy oak door leading to the study. I told Marcus that the study was strictly off-limits to everyone, and nobody was opening any safes today or any other day. Marcus dropped his fake, polite, professional demeanor entirely. His face turned bright red and his small eyes narrowed with aggressive malice. He reached into his wrinkled suit jacket and pulled out a heavy metal pry bar and a small black leather pouch containing specialized lockpicking tools. He was not just a sleazy lawyer, he was a hired criminal thug masquerading as a legal professional. He took another threatening step toward me, raising the heavy metal bar slightly, and told me to move aside right now. He said a little girl like me did not want to get physically hurt over some boring old paperwork that did not even belong to me. He actually thought he could intimidate me with cheap physical threats and aggressive posturing in my own hallway. I did not flinch, and I did not back away a single inch. I looked directly into his angry, bloodshot eyes and felt an overwhelming wave of absolute disgust. This pathetic man was perfectly willing to assault a young woman in her own home just to help a failing crypto investor steal a $15 million property from an elderly black man. I told Marcus that breaking into a locked residential safe was a severe federal felony, and doing it with professional burglary tools would guarantee him a very long prison sentence. He sneered at me and said nobody was going to call the police because my parents and Liam would personally cover up the entire incident. He bragged loudly that my father Desmond had already signed a waiver allowing him full access to the property, meaning I had absolutely no legal right to stop him from doing his job. He lunged forward suddenly and tried to shove me violently out of the way with his heavy shoulder. I stood my ground, catching his arm and pushing him back with a sudden burst of defensive adrenaline. He stumbled backwards slightly, clearly surprised that I fought back instead of cowering in fear and crying like he expected. I could see the desperate greed in his eyes, matching the exact same toxic greed that had infected my entire family. He gripped the metal pry bar tighter in his sweaty fist and took a deep, ragged breath, looking like he was ready to completely abandon his fake legal persona and resort to pure brute violence. He told me I was making a massive mistake and that Liam had explicitly warned him about my stubborn and difficult attitude. He raised the metal bar higher, preparing to smash the heavy oak door right behind me, or possibly hit me if I did not move out of his way. He thought he had the ultimate upper hand because he was bigger and stronger and heavily armed with a weapon. He thought I was just a helpless, isolated woman, completely trapped in an empty house with a senile old man. But he had absolutely no idea who he was actually dealing with, and he was completely unaware of the sophisticated digital traps I had already set all over the property waiting to be sprung. Marcus took a heavy step forward, his cheap leather shoes squeaking slightly on the polished floorboards. He was breathing heavily, his face twisted into an ugly snarl of pure physical intimidation. He expected me to cower in fear, or perhaps start crying and begging him to leave me alone. I did not step back. I did not raise my voice, and I certainly did not scream for help. I simply reached over to the small mahogany console table next to the study door and picked up my silver tablet. I tapped the screen once, waking it up, and turned the bright display directly toward his sweaty, flushed face. Marcus stopped dead in his tracks. His eyes darted down to the glowing screen and his thick jaw went completely slack. Displayed in crisp, high-definition color were 4 different live camera feeds. One showed his dark gray sedan parked illegally on the street, clearly showing the missing front license plate. Another showed a perfect clear angle of his face as he picked the front door lock. The third showed him standing exactly where he was right now, holding a heavy metal pry bar like a common street thug. I kept my voice completely flat and monotone, like I was reading a very boring grocery list. I looked him dead in the eye and informed him that under the State Penal Code Section 14.2, what he was currently doing constituted felony breaking and entering. I calmly continued explaining that because he was holding a solid metal pry bar with the clear intent to breach a secure residential wall safe, the charge was automatically elevated to aggravated attempted burglary. I watched the color drain completely out of his face as I recited the exact mandatory minimum sentencing guidelines for armed trespassing. I told him that he was looking at a minimum of 5 to 7 years in a state penitentiary before he even had the chance to see a parole board. He lowered the metal bar slightly, his aggressive bravado rapidly evaporating under the cold, harsh reality of the situation. He tried to speak, but only a pathetic stuttering sound came out of his mouth. I tapped the screen of the tablet again, showing him that a bright red recording icon was flashing continuously in the top right corner. I informed him that these security cameras were not simply recording to a local hard drive inside the house that he could easily destroy. I told him that every single frame of high-definition video, audio, and metadata was currently streaming directly to an encrypted off-site cloud server that he could never reach. I explained that even if he somehow managed to overpower me and smash the tablet into a million pieces, the federal authorities would still have a perfect permanent record of his face, his voice, and his incredibly stupid decision to break into my family home. Marcus swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously in his thick throat. The cheap thug persona he had been projecting just seconds ago completely shattered into a million tiny pieces. He realized he was not dealing with a frightened and isolated babysitter. He was dealing with a professional forensic accountant who made a living out of completely destroying arrogant men who thought they were above the law. He slowly lowered the metal pry bar until it was resting completely harmlessly against his leg. He took a hesitant step backward away from the locked study door. He stammered out a weak, pathetic apology, claiming there had been a massive misunderstanding and that Liam had completely misled him about the security situation at the house. I did not give him a single inch of sympathy. I stared at him with absolute contempt and told him he had exactly 10 seconds to turn around, walk out the front door, and drive his unregistered gray sedan off my property before I pressed the single button that would instantly transmit the entire video file directly to the local police dispatch. I started counting out loud backwards from 10. I did not even make it to the number 8 before Marcus turned and practically ran down the hallway. He scrambled out the front door, leaving it wide open behind him in his absolute panic. I walked to the threshold and watched him throw his heavy body into the driver's seat of his car. The engine roared to life and the tires screeched violently against the asphalt as he sped away, leaving a cloud of gray exhaust smoke hanging in the humid afternoon air. I casually pushed the heavy front door closed and locked the deadbolt, sliding the thick brass chain into place for good measure. I took a deep, cleansing breath, letting the silence of the large house wash over me once again. I had successfully defended the original property deed without breaking a single sweat. But my moment of quiet victory was incredibly short-lived. Almost exactly 3 seconds after Marcus drove away, my cell phone began vibrating violently in the front pocket of my cardigan. I pulled it out and looked at the bright screen. It was an incoming video call from my father, Desmond. I knew exactly what this was about. Marcus must have called Liam in an absolute panic the second he got into his car, and Liam had immediately run to my father to complain that I was ruining their massive financial deal. I swiped the green button to accept the call and held the phone up to my face, keeping my expression entirely blank and unbothered. The screen connected, showing my father standing on the expansive balcony of a highly luxurious hotel suite in Miami. Behind him, I could see the bright blue ocean and palm trees swaying in the gentle tropical breeze. I could also see Liam pacing nervously back and forth inside the hotel room, wearing his ridiculous white linen suit and gnawing on his thumbnail like a terrified child. But there was absolutely nothing gentle or relaxing about my father's face. His skin was flushed dark red with absolute fury, and a prominent vein in the center of his forehead was bulging violently. He was gripping his phone so tightly, I thought the screen might actually shatter in his hand. He did not even bother to say hello. He immediately started screaming at the top of his lungs, his voice echoing harshly through the small speaker of my phone. He demanded to know exactly what the hell I thought I was doing interfering with Liam's professional legal associate. He called me an incredibly stupid and ungrateful child who had no idea how the real world of high-level business operated. He yelled that Marcus was a highly respected courier sent to retrieve simple administrative paperwork, and that I had completely humiliated the family by treating him like a common criminal. I watched my father absolutely lose his mind over a video connection thousands of miles away. He was putting on a massive show of parental authority, completely blind to the fact that he was yelling at the only person who actually knew the devastating truth about his pathetic, fake life. I let him scream until his voice grew hoarse. I stood perfectly still in the quiet hallway of the house he had secretly mortgaged to dangerous criminals, listening to him defend the exact same people who were actively planning to destroy him. When he finally paused to take a breath, I looked directly into the camera lens of my phone. I did not raise my voice to match his absolute hysteria. I spoke in a low, calm, and incredibly dangerous tone. I told my father that his highly respected courier was carrying a set of professional lock-picking tools and a heavy metal crowbar. I asked him, since when did simple administrative paperwork require breaking a secure residential wall safe with a crowbar? I told him that if he ever sent a violent thug to break into my grandfather's house again, I would not just call the police. I told him I would personally ensure that the entire world knew exactly how desperate and completely broke the great Desmond really was. The silence on the video call stretched for several long seconds after I delivered my warning. My father stared at me through the screen, his face completely frozen in a mask of absolute shock. He was not used to anyone challenging his authority, let alone the daughter he had spent his entire life actively diminishing. But the shock quickly morphed into a dark and venomous rage. He leaned closer to his phone camera, his eyes narrowing into tiny slits of pure hatred. He told me I had no idea who I was messing with, and that my little threats meant absolutely nothing to a man of his standing in the community. He said I was nothing but an arrogant, ungrateful child, playing a highly dangerous game I could not possibly win. He told me that since I wanted to act like a hostile enemy, he was going to treat me exactly like one. He proudly announced that he was done playing nice and waiting for the administrative paperwork to clear. He said the moment he hung up the phone, he was calling a highly connected family law attorney back in the city. He told me he was filing an emergency petition for full legal conservatorship over Grandpa Elijah. He planned to have the courts officially declare my grandfather medically and psychologically incompetent to manage his own affairs. He bragged that he had already paid a shady private doctor a massive sum of money to sign a sworn medical affidavit attesting to severe advanced dementia. He said once the judge granted the conservatorship order, he would have absolute total control over every single penny, every single property, and every single decision regarding my grandfather's life. He promised me with a sickening smile that the very first thing he would do with his new legal power was have me formally evicted from the family home and thrown out onto the street with nothing but the clothes on my back. I listened to his vile plan without letting a single emotion show on my face. He was actively plotting to strip his own father of his basic human rights and legal autonomy just to steal his money and save his own pathetic skin. It was a new level of depravity even for him. I realized then that my father had completely lost any remaining shred of his moral compass. The intense pressure from the loan sharks had turned him into a cornered animal, willing to devour his own family just to survive another day. He thought the heavy threat of legal eviction and a messy public court battle would break my spirit and force me to apologize and beg for his mercy. When I did not immediately start crying or pleading with him to reconsider, he decided to escalate his attack even further. He sneered at me and said he knew exactly how to put a stubborn brat like me in her place. He told me that as the head of the household, he had the ultimate power to cut off my lifelines. He pulled a second phone out of his pocket and tapped the screen a few times while maintaining intense eye contact with me on the video call. He coldly informed me that he had just logged into the primary banking portal and completely frozen all of the joint family accounts. He canceled the debit cards he had instructed me to use for my grandfather's expensive medication, and he permanently blocked my access to the emergency household funds. He said I was completely cut off from the family wealth effective immediately. He told me to see how long my arrogant attitude lasted when I could not afford to buy groceries, pay the utility bills, or even put gas in my car. He said he was going to starve me out until I learned my proper place in the family hierarchy. He expected me to panic because he truly believed I was completely financially dependent on his non-existent wealth. He had spent years telling his country club friends and our extended family that I was a struggling accountant who desperately needed my parents' charity to survive. He had repeated his own narcissistic lies so often that he actually believed them to be the absolute truth. He told me I had exactly 24 hours to call Marcus back, apologize profusely, and hand over the original property deed. He said if I did not comply by tomorrow afternoon, I would be completely ruined. He ended the video call abruptly, leaving me staring at my own reflection on the dark screen of my phone. The hallway was completely silent again. I slowly lowered the phone and let out a soft, quiet laugh. The sheer absurdity of his threats was almost comical. He thought he was starving me out by freezing accounts that were already completely empty and heavily overdrawn. He was using a non-existent fortune to threaten a woman who had meticulously saved and invested her own money for the past 10 years. My father did not know that I had over $100,000 in my own private high-yield savings accounts. He did not know that my forensic accounting firm paid me a highly lucrative salary and massive annual bonuses for uncovering complex corporate fraud. He assumed my life was small because I did not flaunt designer labels or lease luxury vehicles I could not afford. And most importantly, he did not know that his aggressive threat to file for full conservatorship over Grandpa Elijah was completely and utterly useless. You cannot legally seize control of assets that no longer belong to the person you are trying to declare incompetent. My grandfather had already transferred his entire massive estate into the irrevocable blind trust the night before, and I was the sole legal trustee. My father could waive his fake medical affidavits in front of any judge he wanted, but it would not change the fact that the $15 million resort was completely untouchable. I walked into the kitchen and poured myself a tall glass of cold water. I pulled my personal laptop toward me and logged into the bank portal just to see exactly what he had done. Sure enough, there were bright red lock icons next to all the joint checking and savings accounts. I clicked on the balance details and smiled. The primary family checking account he had just weaponized against me had a negative balance of $412. He was trying to suffocate me with an empty vacuum. I took a slow sip of water, feeling incredibly grounded and completely in control of the situation. My father thought he had just delivered a devastating final blow that would leave me crippled and begging for help. He thought he was playing a brilliant game of chess when in reality he had just proudly moved his pieces directly into my carefully laid trap. I looked out the kitchen window at the setting sun, knowing the ultimate showdown in Florida was rapidly approaching. My father had just given me the exact motivation I needed to ensure his complete and total destruction without a single ounce of regret. The sun had completely disappeared behind the trees, leaving the kitchen in soft twilight shadows. My phone buzzed against the marble counter, breaking the quiet atmosphere. I glanced at the screen and saw my sister Sienna's face flashing brightly. She was calling me through a video app, probably using the high-speed wireless internet on their luxury yacht. I took a steady breath and tapped the screen to answer, but I also immediately pressed the hidden screen record button on my device. I knew Sienna never called me unless she wanted to explicitly brag about something or make me feel completely inferior. I held the phone up and kept my facial expression completely neutral. Sienna was sitting in the back of a luxury town car holding a crystal glass of sparkling water. She was wearing massive designer sunglasses even though it was already getting dark outside. She smiled at the camera, but it was a completely hollow and cruel smile. She told me she just wanted to call and check on the poor lonely babysitter. She asked if I was having fun changing adult diapers while she was living her best life in South Florida. I did not give her the satisfaction of a defensive reaction. I simply told her that Grandpa Elijah was resting quietly and that the house was very peaceful. Sienna let out a loud, obnoxious laugh and leaned closer to her camera. She said she was so glad I was enjoying the peace and quiet, because she was currently on her way to do some serious damage to her bank account. She proudly announced that she and Liam were on their way to an exclusive exotic car dealership in downtown Miami. She told me she was finally going to buy the bright yellow supercar she had been wanting for the past 3 years. She bragged that Liam had promised her any car she wanted as a special reward for being such a supportive wife during his stressful business negotiations. I kept recording and carefully asked her how they could possibly afford a $500,000 exotic car when Liam's crypto business was currently restructuring. I purposely used gentle corporate language to stroke her massive ego and encourage her to keep talking. Sienna rolled her eyes and completely took the bait. She arrogantly told me that crypto was just a side hobby for Liam and that his real talent was in high-level real estate acquisition. She explicitly stated on the recorded video call that Liam was closing a massive cash deal tomorrow morning involving Grandpa Elijah's old coastal property. She said the buyer was wiring millions of dollars directly into their personal offshore accounts the second the papers were signed. I asked her if she meant the joint family accounts or her own personal accounts. She laughed again and said Liam was too smart to share the massive payout with my parents. She confessed that Liam was going to pay off his immediate private debts first and then funnel the rest of the cash into their private Delaware holding company. She actually admitted out loud that my parents thought the money was going to save the entire family, but Liam was secretly planning to take the bulk of the cash and leave them completely stranded. It was a breathtaking admission of absolute premeditated fraud and familial betrayal. Sienna was not just a passive accessory to Liam's crimes. She was actively conspiring with her husband to steal the family real estate, pay off dangerous loan sharks, and then completely screw over our own parents in the process. She told me I should probably start looking for a cheap apartment to rent because once Liam officially sold the resort, they were going to put the main family house on the market next. She gave me a final condescending wave and told me to have fun eating frozen dinners before abruptly ending the call. I stopped the screen recording and watched the file save directly to my secure encrypted cloud folder. Sienna had just provided the exact verbal confession the federal authorities would need to prove she had full prior knowledge of the fraudulent transaction and the illegal diversion of funds. I walked back down the dark wooden stairs to the basement, holding my phone tightly in my hand. Grandpa Elijah was sitting at the metal desk reading through the final trust documents. I sat down across from him and played the audio from Sienna's video call. He listened to his granddaughter's cruel and arrogant voice echoing in the quiet room. He heard her casually plotting to steal his legacy and leave her own parents with absolutely nothing. He did not look sad anymore. His expression hardened into pure cold steel. He nodded slowly and told me it was time to make the final phone call. He reached into his suit pocket and pulled out a small black leather address book. He flipped to a page near the end and dialed a number on his secure burner phone. He placed the phone on the desk and turned on the speaker. The phone rang twice before a deep, commanding voice answered. Grandpa Elijah smiled warmly and greeted his old friend. He called him Judge Harrison. He was a highly respected federal prosecutor who had known my grandfather for over 40 years. They had fought in the civil rights movement together and built their respective careers from the ground up. Grandpa Elijah quickly explained the entire situation to his old friend, outlining the forged power of attorney, the fake Delaware shell company, the dangerous Cayman Island loan sharks, and the impending fraudulent sale scheduled for tomorrow morning in Miami. Judge Harrison listened in complete silence, his legal mind processing the massive web of financial crimes. When my grandfather finished explaining, Judge Harrison let out a low whistle. He asked if we had the hard evidence to back up these massive allegations. I leaned forward and told him I was a certified forensic accountant and that I had already compiled a complete encrypted digital dossier containing wire transfer logs, IP addresses, forged signature files, and a recorded verbal confession from the co-conspirator. Judge Harrison let out a booming laugh and told my grandfather he had raised a brilliant and incredibly dangerous granddaughter. He gave me a secure federal email address and instructed me to send the encrypted file immediately. I opened my laptop and transferred the massive evidence package directly to his secure server. Judge Harrison confirmed receipt a few minutes later. He told us he was currently looking at the forged documents and the clear money laundering trail. He said this was not just a simple local real estate dispute. This was a textbook case of federal wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and international money laundering. He promised my grandfather that he would personally contact the special agent in charge of the Federal Bureau of Investigation White-Collar Crime Division in Miami tonight. He said he would make sure a fully armed federal strike team was waiting discreetly inside the hotel lobby tomorrow morning. We thanked him and ended the call. The final piece of the ultimate trap was now locked firmly into place. All we had to do was wait for the sun to rise. The basement felt incredibly quiet after we ended the call with the federal judge. The digital clock on the metal desk slowly flipped to exactly midnight. We had the electronic evidence perfectly secured, but Grandpa Elijah knew that fighting a forged legal document required absolute ironclad physical proof. He looked at me and said the federal raid in Miami would punish them for the fraud, but we still needed to completely protect the actual $15 million asset from any future civil lawsuits. He told me that loan sharks and desperate family members would tie up a regular estate in probate court for decades, trying to find a legal loophole. That was when the heavy front doorbell rang, echoing loudly through the silent house. I walked upstairs and checked the secure video feed on my tablet. A sleek black town car was parked in our driveway. Standing on the front porch was a tall, elegantly dressed older black woman carrying a thick leather briefcase. I recognized her immediately as Beverly, a highly respected senior notary public and a former corporate attorney who had worked with my grandfather for over 30 years. I unlocked the heavy deadbolt and let her inside. Beverly did not smile or make unnecessary small talk. She understood the extreme gravity of our situation. She walked straight down the hallway and directly into my grandfather's private study, stepping right over the faint scuff marks left by Marcus and his metal pry bar. Grandpa Elijah was already sitting behind his massive oak desk waiting for her. He had opened the hidden wall safe and placed the original authentic property deed for the coastal resort directly in the center of the desk. The thick parchment paper looked ancient and incredibly valuable under the warm glow of the desk lamp. Beverly sat down across from him and opened her briefcase. She pulled out a massive stack of legal documents printed on heavy bonded paper. These were the final establishment papers for an irrevocable blind trust. She looked at my grandfather with a deeply serious expression and asked him if he was absolutely certain he wanted to proceed with this drastic action. Grandpa Elijah did not hesitate for a single second. He placed his hands flat on the desk and told Beverly that his own son had invited a parasite into their family and allowed him to steal their generational wealth. He said he was not going to let a spoiled crypto investor and a group of offshore loan sharks dismantle the empire he had spent 50 years building with his own blood and sweat. Beverly nodded slowly and began explaining the explicit terms of the blind trust to ensure absolute legal compliance. She explained that by signing these specific documents, my grandfather was permanently surrendering his own direct legal ownership of the $15 million estate. The property would instantly belong to the trust itself, creating an impenetrable corporate fortress around the massive asset. She explained that an irrevocable trust could never be altered, broken, or dissolved by any family member, regardless of any medical affidavits or conservatorship threats my father Desmond might try to file in the future. The trust was a complete financial black hole to the outside world. Anyone who tried to claim the property or force a sale would find themselves fighting a faceless legal entity, backed by strict federal law. Then, Beverly turned to me and handed me a separate stack of thick papers. She explained that a blind trust required a single highly competent trustee to manage the assets and execute the final will of the grantor. Grandpa Elijah had officially named me as the sole legal trustee and the exclusive executive director of his entire family portfolio. I stared at my name printed in bold black ink across the top of the legal document. For my entire life, my parents had treated me like a financial burden and an embarrassing failure. They told everyone I was just a boring accountant who lacked the vision and the sophistication to understand real wealth. My sister Sienna had mocked my modest lifestyle and laughed at my practical daily choices. Yet here I was, sitting in the quiet study at midnight, taking absolute legal control over a massive real estate empire. Grandpa Elijah looked at me with deep pride shining brightly in his dark eyes. He told me I was the only person in the family who truly understood the value of hard work and quiet integrity. He said true power does not need to be loud or flashy, and that I had already proven my strength by surviving their toxic abuse without ever losing my own moral compass. Beverly handed my grandfather a heavy gold fountain pen. The room fell completely silent as he began to sign his name on the designated lines. His hand was completely steady, and his signature was bold and exact. He signed the asset transfer forms, the new title declarations, and the official trust establishment documents. With every stroke of the pen, he was legally severing my parents and my sister from the family wealth forever. They had willingly traded their birthright for a fake luxury lifestyle and a massive pile of dirty debt. When he finally finished signing, Beverly took her heavy brass notary stamp and pressed it firmly into the thick paper. The loud, solid thump of the stamp hitting the desk sounded exactly like a massive iron vault door slamming shut and locking forever. She signed her own name next to the embossed seals, officially binding the documents under state and federal law. It was completely done. The $15 million coastal resort no longer belonged to Grandpa Elijah. It now belonged entirely to the trust under my complete and exclusive control. Beverly packed the original deed and the signed trust documents into a secure fireproof envelope. She promised to file them directly with the federal registry the second the government offices opened in the morning, ensuring the digital property records would update long before Liam ever walked into that boardroom in Miami. She shook my grandfather's hand and gave me a respectful nod before walking back out to her waiting town car. I stood on the front porch and watched her drive away into the dark night. My parents and Sienna were currently sleeping in their luxurious five-star hotel suites, dreaming of the massive payout they thought they were getting tomorrow. They had absolutely no idea that their entire financial future had just been completely erased by a single brass stamp in the middle of the night. I walked back inside and locked the heavy front door, feeling a profound sense of absolute security. The trap was no longer just a digital threat or a collection of wire transfer receipts. It was now an impenetrable legal reality. When Liam sat down in that fancy hotel conference room in just a few short hours and tried to sell the resort, he would be legally attempting to sell a property that did not even exist under my grandfather's name anymore. He would be committing textbook federal wire fraud right in front of the hidden undercover agents. I turned off the hallway lights and went to my bedroom to get dressed. It was going to be a very busy morning, and I wanted to be fully prepared when my phone inevitably rang to broadcast their spectacular downfall. The sun rose over the quiet suburban neighborhood, casting a bright yellow glow through my bedroom window. I had only slept for a few hours, but I felt incredibly energized and completely awake. I walked into my bathroom and washed my face, staring at my reflection in the mirror. Today was the day I finally stopped being the family scapegoat and took complete control of my own destiny. I knew that when the dust finally settled today, my entire life would be completely different. I would no longer be the obedient servant hiding in the background. I was the one holding all the cards. I opened my closet and bypassed the casual sweaters and faded jeans I usually wore around the house. Instead, I pulled out a tailored charcoal gray power suit and a crisp white silk blouse. If I was going to officially step into the role of sole trustee and executive director of a massive real estate empire, I was going to look exactly the part. I got dressed quickly and brushed my hair back into a sleek, tight bun. I walked downstairs to the kitchen and opened my laptop, placing it firmly on the marble island. It was exactly 8 in the morning on the East Coast. I logged into the Federal Property Registry database and typed in the parcel identification number for the $15 million coastal resort. My heart beat a little faster as the search results loaded on the bright screen. Beverly had been true to her word. The official property records had already been completely updated in the system. The owner was no longer listed as Elijah Thomas. The new owner was officially registered as the Coastal Legacy Blind Trust, and the sole legal trustee was listed clearly as Tessa Thomas. I smiled, staring at my own name in the official federal database. I now possessed absolute legal authority over the property and every single penny attached to it. But simply owning the property was not enough to put Liam in federal prison. I needed to make absolutely sure that his actions in Miami today crossed the line into undeniable federal wire fraud. As a forensic accountant, I knew exactly how the financial statutes worked. Wire fraud requires the intentional use of interstate electronic communications to facilitate a scheme to defraud someone of money or property. The federal wire fraud statute is incredibly severe, and it carries extremely harsh mandatory prison sentences for every single electronic infraction. Liam was already planning to use a forged power of attorney, but I needed him to actively transmit the fraudulent paperwork and banking instructions across state lines. I opened a highly secure email portal provided to me by Judge Harrison the night before. I drafted an official electronic memorandum, acting in my new capacity as the sole trustee. I sent the memo directly to the title company handling the Miami transaction. I did not tell them the sale was fraudulent because the undercover federal agents were already embedded in the buyer's team. Instead, I officially updated the final banking routing instructions for the multi-million-dollar wire transfer. I redirected the destination account from Liam's private offshore shell company to a highly secure federal escrow account monitored directly by the Bureau of Investigation. When Liam sat down and electronically transmitted his forged signature to claim those funds, he would be officially stealing from a federal entity using interstate wires. By sending this email, I was locking the final door to his metaphorical prison cell. It was the perfect, unavoidable trap. I hit the send button and watched the encrypted email disappear into the digital ether. The trap was now fully armed and completely inescapable. I heard the slow, steady sound of footsteps coming down the wooden staircase. Grandpa Elijah walked into the kitchen looking incredibly rested and remarkably peaceful for a man who had just signed away his entire life fortune. He was wearing his favorite knitted cardigan and a pair of comfortable slippers. He did not look like a senile old victim anymore. He looked like a wise general who had successfully outmaneuvered his enemies on the battlefield. I poured him a fresh cup of hot black coffee and handed it to him. He took a long sip and looked at me wearing my sharp charcoal suit. He smiled broadly and told me I looked exactly like the formidable executive he always knew I could be. He reached into his deep pocket and pulled out a heavy metal keyring along with a small black leather notebook. He slid them across the marble counter toward me. He explained that the notebook contained every single master password security code and private combination lock for his remaining personal bank accounts, safety deposit boxes, and investment portfolios. He told me he was officially transferring complete financial power of attorney over his personal life directly to me. He said he no longer trusted my father Desmond with a single penny of his money, and he wanted to make absolutely sure I had the ultimate legal authority to protect him from any future retaliation. I picked up the small leather notebook, feeling the heavy weight of his absolute trust. For decades, my parents had desperately tried to manipulate and scheme their way into his deep pockets. They had lied, cheated, and practically begged for his money, while simultaneously treating him like a burdensome nuisance. They had completely ruined their own financial lives trying to fast-track their inheritance. Yet here he was, freely handing the keys to his entire kingdom over to the granddaughter they had all dismissed as a boring loser. I promised my grandfather that I would protect his legacy with my life, and that I would never allow Desmond or Valerie to exploit him ever again. We sat together at the kitchen island, drinking our coffee in comfortable silence. The large grandfather clock in the hallway ticked away the remaining minutes. I pulled up the secure tracking portal on my laptop and kept my eyes glued to the screen. The high-stakes meeting in Miami was scheduled to begin at exactly 10 in the morning. Liam would be walking into that luxurious beachfront boardroom wearing his cheap white linen suit, completely convinced that he was the smartest man in the entire state of Florida. My mother Valerie and my father Desmond would be sitting right next to him, beaming with false pride. They would probably be sipping complimentary mimosas and taking pictures for their social media accounts, totally oblivious to the federal strike team waiting quietly in the hotel lobby downstairs. He would sit down across from the buyers, completely unaware that the men shaking his hand were actually highly trained undercover federal agents wearing hidden recording devices. I watched the digital clock on my computer screen slowly change from 9:45 to 9:50. The anticipation was practically vibrating in the air around us. I had spent my entire adult life being talked down to being marginalized and being forced to clean up the ridiculous messes my family constantly created. I had paid my own way through life while they stole, borrowed, and faked their way through high society. But in just a few short minutes, the universe was going to deliver a massive dose of absolute justice. I rested my hands on the keyboard and took a deep breath. The stage was perfectly set. The actors were all in their places, and the federal net was drawn tight. All we had to do now was wait for the golden boy to enthusiastically sign his own name on his very long prison sentence. The digital clock on my laptop screen flipped to 9:55. I was just about to close the tracking portal when my cell phone began to vibrate violently against the marble countertop. I looked down and saw Liam's name flashing brightly on the screen. He was calling me on a standard audio line, probably stepping out of the luxurious hotel conference room for a quick minute to check his blind spots. A man who is about to commit massive financial fraud is naturally going to be extremely paranoid, no matter how arrogant he pretends to be. He needed to make absolutely sure the pathetic babysitter back home was completely neutralized before he sat down at that table. I let the phone ring 4 times, letting his anxiety build up in the silence, before I finally swiped the screen to answer. I did not say hello. I just brought the phone to my ear and waited for him to speak. I could hear the faint sound of expensive elevator music in the background, and the muffled chatter of wealthy hotel guests passing through the wide corridors. Liam cleared his throat, trying to project his usual arrogant confidence, but his voice cracked slightly on the very first word. He asked me how my morning was going and if I was enjoying the severe financial consequences of my stupid actions yesterday. He fully expected me to be crying and begging him to tell my father to unfreeze the family bank accounts. He desperately wanted me to sound broken and defeated so he could walk back into that boardroom feeling like a powerful, untouchable conqueror. I kept my voice incredibly soft and completely relaxed. I told him I was actually having a wonderful morning, drinking fresh coffee and reviewing some fascinating legal documents with Grandpa Elijah. I heard a sharp intake of breath on his end of the line. My calm demeanor was the absolute last thing he expected to hear from a woman who supposedly had no money and no future. He quickly shifted his strategy, trying to sound like a stern parental authority figure. He told me he was calling to give me one final chance to cooperate before my father officially filed the emergency conservatorship papers and kicked me out onto the street. He demanded to know exactly what I said to Marcus yesterday because the sleazy lawyer had completely stopped answering his phone calls. I smiled, staring at the bright federal property registry open on my laptop. I told Liam that Marcus was probably just very busy researching the mandatory minimum prison sentences for felony breaking and entering. I casually mentioned that high-definition security cameras are incredibly useful for identifying aggressive men carrying professional lock-picking tools and heavy metal crowbars. There was a long, heavy silence on the phone. I could practically hear the gears grinding in his head as he realized his proxy lawyer had not just failed, but had likely been caught on tape committing a serious violent crime. But Liam was way too arrogant to admit any kind of defeat. He let out a nervous, forced laugh and told me I was completely delusional. He said I was just making up wild stories to cover up the fact that I was completely terrified of his power. He tried to steer the conversation back to his upcoming glorious victory. He proudly announced that he was standing right outside the executive boardroom and that the private buyers were already sitting inside with millions of dollars ready to be wired. He told me I was about to watch my grandfather's entire legacy disappear with a single stroke of his pen, and there was absolutely nothing I could do to stop it. This was the exact moment I decided to start planting the heavy seeds of absolute panic. I asked him in a very innocent, helpful tone if he had remembered to double-check the final routing numbers for the massive wire transfer. I told him that dealing with such huge sums of cash can be incredibly complicated, especially when the funds are being diverted to international offshore accounts. Liam stopped breathing for a full second. His voice dropped to a harsh, urgent whisper. He demanded to know why I was talking about offshore accounts. He asked me what exactly I thought I knew about his private business deals. I did not raise my voice or change my relaxed tone. I casually mentioned that I had been doing some light reading about the banking regulations in the Cayman Islands. I told him I found it fascinating how private lending syndicates operate in the Caribbean, especially when they issue massive aggressive margin calls on failing cryptocurrency investments. I heard the distinct sound of Liam dropping his heavy leather briefcase onto the carpeted hotel floor. He was completely panicking now. The Cayman Islands syndicate was his ultimate dark secret. It was the one major detail my parents and my sister absolutely did not know about. He started stammering desperately, asking me who I had been talking to and what kind of ridiculous lies I was spreading. He told me I was a crazy, jealous sister-in-law trying to ruin his perfectly curated life because I was lonely and bitter. I let him ramble and curse for a few seconds before dropping the final psychological anchor. I told him he should probably pay very close attention to the escrow instructions today. I casually suggested that sometimes high-level buyers use highly secure federal escrow accounts when they suspect a property might have fraudulent title issues. I used the word federal very deliberately, letting it hang heavily in the air between us. I wanted that specific highly dangerous word to echo constantly in his mind when he sat down across from those men. Liam was completely backed into a tight corner of his own making. A smart man would have immediately recognized that his entire criminal scheme was totally compromised. A smart man would have picked up his dropped briefcase, walked straight out of that luxury hotel lobby, and disappeared before the meeting even officially started. But Liam was not a smart man. He was an incredibly greedy and deeply desperate man drowning in dangerous mob debt. His toxic pride and absolute terror completely overrode his basic logic. He convinced himself that I was just making wild, educated guesses and throwing out random, scary words to bluff him into backing down. He yelled into the phone telling me I was a pathetic loser who would never understand high-stakes finance or real power. He said he was going straight into that room to sign the legal papers and make history. He aggressively ended the call, leaving me listening to the dead silence. I placed my phone back on the counter and smiled warmly at my grandfather. The psychological warfare had worked perfectly. I had given Liam every possible warning to walk away, but his absolute greed had completely blinded him. He was now eagerly marching straight into his own total destruction. It was exactly 10 in the morning when my phone lit up again. This time it was a video call request from my father, Desmond. He was not calling to yell at me anymore. He was calling to gloat. I accepted the video connection and propped my phone up against a ceramic coffee mug on the kitchen island so Grandpa Elijah and I could both watch the screen perfectly. The high-definition camera on my father's phone gave us a crystal-clear view of the executive boardroom inside the Miami hotel. It was a massive, beautiful room with incredible floor-to-ceiling windows showing a stunning panoramic view of the Atlantic Ocean. The bright morning sun was reflecting intensely off the crashing waves, making the entire room look like it was glowing with pure golden money. Sitting around a massive polished mahogany conference table was my entire toxic family, completely oblivious to the federal trap closing in around them. My mother Valerie was sitting near the large window wearing a ridiculously oversized diamond necklace she definitely could not afford. She was holding a tall crystal flute filled with fresh orange juice and highly expensive champagne, smiling like she had just won the massive state lottery. My sister Sienna was sitting right next to her, constantly checking her own reflection in her phone screen and slowly fixing her glossy pink lip color. They looked exactly like a pair of absolute hungry vultures waiting patiently to feast on a fresh carcass. My father Desmond was holding his phone up, making sure I had a perfect unobstructed view of the very center of the table. He leaned directly into the microphone and told me to pay very close attention because I was about to watch history being made. He said he wanted me to witness the exact moment our family secured its long-term financial legacy and left me completely behind in the dust. I kept my face entirely blank and simply told him I would not miss this event for the world. At the absolute head of the long mahogany table sat Liam. He had taken off his crisp white linen suit jacket and draped it carelessly over the back of his plush leather chair, trying his hardest to look like a relaxed, untouchable billionaire. But I could easily see the dark, wet patches of sweat forming under the arms of his expensive tailored dress shirt. The heavy seeds of panic I had planted during our last phone call were definitely still rattling around inside his head, but his staggering greed was forcing him to push forward, blindly. Sitting directly across from Liam were three men wearing very sharp, dark charcoal suits. They looked incredibly professional and completely unbothered by the tense atmosphere in the room. Liam truly thought these quiet men were the shady corporate representatives for the offshore Cayman lending syndicate. He thought they were dirty money launderers ready to hand over millions of dollars in untraceable electronic cash. I knew the absolute truth. Those three quiet men were highly trained undercover federal agents from the white-collar crime division, and they were currently wearing hidden cameras and sensitive recording devices, perfectly concealed under their expensive silk ties. Liam cleared his throat loudly, demanding the full attention of the entire room. He picked up a thick stack of legal papers and tapped them aggressively against the wooden table to straighten the edges. He looked directly into my father's phone camera, making sure I was watching his big, triumphant moment. He told me he sincerely hoped I had my bags packed, because the second he signed these documents, he was officially taking absolute control of the entire family portfolio. He bragged that his very first executive order as the new head of the family was going to be kicking me out of the old house. He said I had been a constant miserable drain on their resources for far too long, and it was finally time for me to face the harsh reality of the real world. He actually believed he was putting me in my place. He had absolutely no idea that he was confessing his clear criminal intent directly into a live federal microphone. The lead undercover federal agent sitting across from Liam folded his hands neatly on the table. He asked Liam in a very calm and highly professional voice if he was absolutely certain he had the legal authority to sell the coastal property today. The agent specifically asked if the current legal owner, Elijah Thomas, was fully aware of the massive transaction and if the attached power of attorney was entirely legitimate. It was a highly calculated legal question designed to establish undeniable premeditated fraud on the official federal record. Liam let out a loud, arrogant laugh that echoed off the thick glass windows. He confidently told the undercover agent that the old man back home was completely senile and had absolutely no idea what day it was, let alone how to manage a massive commercial real estate deal. He proudly patted the forged document and loudly declared that he was the sole authorized legal representative for the estate. My father Desmond chimed in from behind the camera, eagerly backing up Liam's massive and dangerous lie. He loudly confirmed to the room that Grandpa Elijah was medically incompetent and that the entire family fully supported Liam's authority to sell the valuable resort immediately. They were literally weaving their own ropes and tightening them around their own necks on live video. Liam reached into his front shirt pocket and pulled out a heavy gold fountain pen. He held it up to the bright sunlight, admiring the shiny metal, before slowly bringing the tip of the pen down toward the signature line on the forged property deed. He looked at the phone camera one last time, giving me a sickeningly sweet and highly condescending smile. He told me to say goodbye to my grandfather's precious resort. I did not blink, and I did not look away. I just sat calmly at my kitchen island with Grandpa Elijah, taking a slow sip of my warm coffee as we watched the arrogant golden boy cross the point of absolutely no return. The heavy gold fountain pen hovered mere inches above the thick signature line on the forged property deed. I watched Liam take a deep breath, puffing out his chest as he prepared to sign away my grandfather's life work. My father, Desmond, was literally leaning over the table with a hungry look in his eyes, his phone still pointed directly at the action, so I would not miss a single second of my supposed defeat. My mother, Valerie, and my sister, Sienna, were practically vibrating with anticipation in their leather chairs. The three undercover federal agents sitting across from them remained perfectly still, watching the golden boy commit to his massive financial crime. I took another slow sip of my warm coffee, feeling the smooth ceramic of the mug against my lips. I did not raise my voice or show any sign of panic. I simply leaned a little closer to the microphone on my phone and spoke in a very clear and even tone. I told Liam to hold his pen for just 1 second. I suggested that before he officially executed a multi-million-dollar real estate transaction, he might want to carefully read Clause 4 of the updated title disclosure attached to the back of his contract. Liam froze. His hand hovered rigidly in the air, the gold pen gleaming in the bright sunlight pouring through the hotel windows. He looked up at my father's phone screen, with a mixture of intense annoyance and sudden creeping dread. He aggressively asked me what nonsense I was babbling about now, and told me to shut up because he was conducting highly sensitive corporate business. I did not shut up. I calmly told him that sensitive corporate business usually requires the seller to actually own the property they are trying to sell. The lead undercover federal agent sitting across the table suddenly reached his hand out and placed it firmly over the forged document, stopping Liam from signing. The agent looked at Liam with a completely blank professional expression and said, "The young lady on the video call makes a very valid point." The agent pulled a sleek silver tablet out of his own leather briefcase and tapped the screen a few times. He slid the tablet across the polished mahogany table until it rested directly in front of Liam. The agent told him that their internal legal team had just run a final routine check on the federal property registry exactly 5 minutes ago to ensure the title was completely clear before transferring the massive wire payment. Liam stared down at the glowing screen of the tablet. I could see the exact moment his entire reality fractured into a million unfixable pieces. All the color instantly drained from his face, leaving his skin looking like pale gray ash. His jaw went slack, and the heavy gold fountain pen slipped from his sweaty fingers, clattering loudly against the wooden table. My father Desmond immediately sensed that something was terribly wrong. He lowered his phone, slightly breaking the perfect camera angle, and leaned over Liam's shoulder to look at the tablet screen. Desmond let out a strange, choked gasp. My mother Valerie demanded to know what was happening, her voice shrill and panicked. The undercover agent did not wait for Liam to explain. He folded his hands neatly on the table and addressed the entire room in a very loud and authoritative voice. He announced that according to the official federal registry, the coastal resort property no longer belonged to Elijah Thomas. He stated very clearly that the deed had been legally and irrevocably transferred into a highly secure financial entity known as the Coastal Legacy Blind Trust. The agent looked directly into Liam's terrified eyes and delivered the ultimate fatal blow. He told Liam that Clause 4 of the trust documents filed early this morning explicitly listed Tessa Thomas as the sole legal trustee and the exclusive executive director with the absolute power to authorize or deny any sale. The silence in the Miami boardroom was absolute and completely suffocating. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Sienna dropped her expensive crystal glass of sparkling water. It shattered against the carpeted floor, but she did not even look down. She just stared at her husband with wide, terrified eyes. Liam looked like a man who had just been thrown out of an airplane without a parachute. He was falling at terminal velocity, and the ground was rushing up to meet him. He started stammering uncontrollably, shaking his head back and forth. He looked at the undercover agent and desperately claimed there must be some kind of massive clerical error at the Federal Registry. He swore that he held the sole legitimate power of attorney and that his father-in-law Desmond had authorized the entire sale. The federal agent shook his head slowly. He told Liam that a power of attorney is instantly rendered null and void the moment a property is transferred into an irrevocable blind trust. He explained that a blind trust is an impenetrable legal fortress and that absolutely no one in that room had the legal standing to sell even a single grain of sand on that beach. The agent leaned forward and picked up the forged property deed that Liam had brought with him. He looked at the fake signature and then looked back at Liam. He calmly stated that since the property was no longer owned by the estate, this contract was entirely dead. My father Desmond finally broke out of his shocked paralysis. He started yelling at the phone camera, screaming my name and demanding to know what I had done. He called me a thief and a manipulative liar. He yelled that I had somehow tricked my senile grandfather into signing away the family fortune behind their backs. I smiled at his absolute hypocrisy. I told my father that Grandpa Elijah was sitting right next to me, and that his mind was sharper than it had been in 20 years. I told him we had spent the entire night reviewing his massive offshore debt and Liam's completely failed crypto investments. I let the truth wash over the room like a tidal wave of ice water. I told my family that I knew exactly where the $2 million came from, and I knew exactly why they were so desperately trying to sell the resort today. Liam buried his face in his hands, letting out a pathetic whimpering sound. He knew his entire scheme was completely exposed. He could not sell the property to save himself from the Cayman Island loan sharks. He had no money, no leverage, and no escape route. The forged deed on the table was no longer his golden ticket to wealth and freedom. It was now just a piece of highly incriminating garbage. The beautiful sunny room in Miami suddenly felt like a very small and incredibly cold prison cell. My mother started crying hysterically, realizing that her fake luxury life was officially over. Sienna was hyperventilating, clutching her designer handbag like it was a life preserver. I watched them completely unravel on the video feed, feeling absolutely no pity for any of them. They had built their entire lives on lies and toxic greed, and now the whole structure was collapsing directly on top of their heads. The fake real estate deal was completely dead, but the real nightmare for Liam and my parents was just about to begin. I watched the devastating silence stretch across the luxurious Miami boardroom. My father was staring at the phone camera with his mouth hanging open. My mother was clutching her diamond necklace, looking like she was about to faint. Liam was completely paralyzed in his chair, staring at the dead contract. I took a deep breath and leaned closer to my phone screen. I told them that the failed real estate transaction was actually the least of their problems right now. I spoke directly to my father Desmond. I told him I knew all about the $2 million loan he and my mother took from the Cayman Island lending syndicate. I watched my father's face turn a sickly shade of green. He looked around the room, terrified that the undercover federal agents had heard me. I told him he did not need to worry about the agents because they were already fully briefed on the international money laundering scheme. I explained to my father that he was incredibly foolish for trusting Liam to fix his massive financial mistakes. I told him that Liam never intended to use the property sale to pay off the family debt. I revealed that Liam had set up a private Delaware shell company to funnel the millions of dollars directly into his own offshore accounts. I watched my father turn slowly to look at Liam. The shock in his eyes was rapidly transforming into violent rage. My father had literally mortgaged his life and his physical safety to violent criminals just to keep up appearances, and his golden son-in-law was planning to steal the only lifeline they had left. Liam tried to speak, but his voice was completely gone. He just shook his head weakly, raising his trembling hands in a pathetic gesture of defense. I did not let him interrupt me. I shifted my gaze to my sister Sienna, who was still hyperventilating, clutching her designer handbag. I told Sienna that she could stop pretending to be a shocked and innocent victim. I announced to the entire room that Sienna was listed as the primary co-signer on the fraudulent Delaware Shell Company. I told my parents that their perfect golden daughter had personally authorized multiple wire transfers using the stolen mob money to buy exotic luxury cars and designer clothes while they were desperately dodging collection calls. My mother Valerie let out a loud, piercing sob. She looked at Sienna with absolute disgust and betrayal. Sienna started crying hysterically, screaming at Liam and hitting his arm. She yelled that Liam had forced her to sign those documents and that she had no idea the money was stolen from criminals. I told Sienna that federal prosecutors do not care about her weak excuses, especially when her signature is on every single illegal transaction. I let them turn on each other for a few moments. It was a spectacular display of absolute toxic collapse. They were tearing each other apart like a pack of starving wolves. But I was not finished delivering my final forensic accounting masterpiece. I told the room to quiet down because I had one more piece of crucial administrative paperwork to explain. I looked directly at Liam, whose face was buried in his hands. I told him that when I hacked into his encrypted hard drive last night, I found the fraudulent promissory notes he had submitted to the Cayman Island loan sharks. I explained that Liam had illegally pledged my grandfather's $15 million resort as physical collateral for his massive crypto debts. The undercover federal agents in the room nodded slowly, acknowledging the severity of the financial crime. I told Liam that because the resort was now legally protected inside an impenetrable blind trust, the physical collateral for his $2 million debt no longer existed. I explained the precise legal mechanism I had executed early this morning. I told them that acting as the sole executive trustee, I had officially reported the fraudulent lien to the federal banking authorities. This action legally severed the trust and the family estate from any obligation to the offshore syndicate. I told my father Desmond that he was officially completely broke and would likely face severe tax fraud investigations, but he was no longer legally tied to the violent loan sharks. The entire $2 million debt had been officially restructured and isolated. I looked at Liam and Sienna and delivered the final absolute knockout punch. I told them that the Cayman Islands syndicate now held a $2 million unsecured debt bearing solely the names of Liam and Sienna. They were completely and entirely on the hook for the stolen mob money. Sienna stopped crying and stared at me through the screen. Her eyes were wide with pure, absolute terror. She realized she was not just going to lose her luxury cars and her fancy lifestyle. She was personally indebted to highly dangerous criminals who did not operate within the boundaries of the legal system. Liam suddenly stood up from his leather chair, his legs shaking so violently he almost collapsed. He started screaming at the phone camera, calling me a monster. He yelled that I had just signed their death warrants. He said the syndicate was going to hunt them down and destroy them. I kept my voice incredibly calm and completely devoid of any sympathy. I told Liam that he was the one who borrowed money from violent criminals. I told him he was the one who tried to steal an old man's legacy to save his own pathetic life. I told him that forensic accounting is simply the art of putting the numbers exactly where they belong, and that I had just balanced his incredibly toxic ledger. The luxurious Miami boardroom was completely silent, except for the sound of Sienna's ragged breathing and my mother's quiet sobbing. The bright morning sun was still shining beautifully outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, but the atmosphere inside the room felt like a cold, dark tomb. The undercover federal agents remained perfectly composed, observing the absolute destruction of a criminal conspiracy. They were simply waiting for the exact right moment to officially announce their presence and make the arrests. But before the lead agent could even open his mouth, a sudden, terrifying noise shattered the heavy silence. It was a loud, violent pounding sound coming directly from the heavy wooden double doors of the executive boardroom. The heavy knocking echoed through the large room, making everyone jump in their seats. Sienna let out a short, terrified scream and covered her mouth with her hands. My father, Desmond, backed away from the table, his eyes fixed on the vibrating wooden doors. Liam stood completely frozen, his face turning as white as a sheet of paper. He knew exactly what that sound meant. The pounding came again, much louder and much more aggressive this time. It sounded like someone was preparing to physically break the doors off their heavy brass hinges. I leaned back in my chair at the kitchen island and took a slow sip of my coffee. I looked at Liam through the phone screen and smiled. I told him he should probably go answer the door. I casually mentioned that private lending syndicates in the Cayman Islands are notoriously impatient when it comes to collecting their debts. I told him that when I redirected his fraudulent wire transfer this morning, I might have also sent an anonymous electronic courtesy notification to the syndicate's local collection agents in Miami. I told Liam that I gave them the exact address of his luxury hotel and the specific room number of his private conference. I said it was the least I could do to help him finalize his highly important business networking. Liam backed away from the table, stumbling over his own feet. He looked like a trapped animal, desperately searching for an exit that did not exist. He turned to the large glass windows, but they were completely sealed. He turned to the undercover federal agents, begging them to help him. He told them there were dangerous men outside the door and that he was going to be killed. He still did not realize that the men sitting across from him were federal law enforcement officers. Sienna scrambled out of her chair and tried to hide behind my mother, but my mother violently pushed Sienna away, telling her not to touch her. The family loyalty they had always faked was completely gone. It had instantly evaporated the second true danger arrived. The heavy pounding on the door happened a third time, followed by a deep, aggressive voice shouting for Liam to open up immediately. The voice belonged to a man who was clearly not interested in discussing legal loopholes or forged documents. The voice belonged to a man who was there to collect $2 million in cash, or take it out of Liam's physical well-being. Liam fell to his knees on the expensive hotel carpet. He started crying hysterically, begging my father to protect him. Desmond just looked down at his golden son-in-law with a mixture of pure disgust and absolute terror. Desmond slowly backed himself into the far corner of the room, raising his hands to show he wanted no part of whatever was about to burst through those doors. I watched the entire scene unfold with a sense of profound peace. I had spent 29 years being told I was completely worthless. I had spent my entire life being treated like a disposable background character in their glamorous fake movie. But today I had written the final script. I had meticulously engineered every single detail of their ultimate downfall, using nothing but my intellect and the absolute truth. I looked at the chaotic scene on my laptop screen, watching my toxic family cower in fear as the consequences of their own horrific actions literally banged on their front door. The real nightmare had finally arrived, and I had secured a front-row seat from the total safety of my grandfather's protected home. The heavy wooden doors of the executive boardroom suddenly burst wide open, splintering the expensive frame. 5 heavily armed tactical agents flooded the luxurious space, shouting clear commands and immediately securing all the exits. Liam screamed and threw his hands over his head, falling completely flat on the carpeted floor. He was sobbing uncontrollably, begging them not to hurt him, still fully believing they were the violent collection agents from the Cayman Islands. He shouted that he did not have the money and tried to blame my father, pointing a shaking finger at Desmond, who was currently cowering in the far corner of the room. But the tactical team did not draw weapons or start breaking legs. Instead, the lead undercover agent, who had been sitting calmly at the conference table, stood up and casually reached into his tailored suit jacket. He pulled out a shiny gold badge and a leather credential wallet, setting it firmly on the polished mahogany table. He looked down at Liam, who was trembling on the floor, and introduced himself as Special Agent Miller from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, White Collar Crime Division. The collective gasp that echoed through the room was loud enough to be heard clearly through my phone speaker. The sheer terror of violent loan sharks was instantly replaced by the crushing, absolute reality of federal prison. Agent Miller signaled to two tactical officers who hauled Liam to his feet and slammed him roughly against the wall. They pulled his arms behind his back, and the loud, sharp click of heavy metal handcuffs echoed through the silent room. Agent Miller began reading Liam his rights, reciting a long, devastating list of severe federal charges, including aggravated wire fraud, interstate money laundering, and conspiracy to commit identity theft. Agent Miller picked up the forged property deed using gloved hands and slid it carefully into a clear plastic evidence bag, telling Liam it was now Exhibit A in a massive federal prosecution. The family loyalty that had been entirely fabricated for my entire life completely shattered into a million tiny pieces right before my eyes. My father Desmond suddenly rushed forward, holding his hands up defensively. He started speaking a mile a minute, desperately trying to distance himself from the man he had called his golden son-in-law just 10 minutes ago. Desmond told the federal agents that he had absolutely no idea what Liam was doing. He claimed Liam was a rogue criminal who had manipulated their innocent family and tried to steal their property without their permission. He threw Liam directly under the bus without a single second of hesitation, hoping to save his own pathetic reputation. Liam violently twisted around in the handcuffs, his face dark red with absolute fury. He screamed at my father, calling him a pathetic coward and a miserable liar. Liam told the agents that Desmond was the one who authorized the forged power of attorney, and that Desmond was the one who originally borrowed the $2 million from the offshore syndicate. They were screaming viciously at each other, exposing every single dark financial secret they had spent years trying to hide. My mother Valerie was having a complete psychological breakdown. She dropped to her knees on the hotel carpet, clutching her expensive designer purse and wailing at the top of her lungs. Her heavy mascara was running down her cheeks in dark, ugly streaks, making her look completely unhinged. She kept repeating over and over that her social life was ruined and that the elite country club members would see her family on the evening news. She was not crying because her son-in-law was going to federal prison or because her family was being violently torn apart. She was exclusively crying because she knew she was going to lose her fake rich status and become the ultimate laughingstock of her wealthy social circle. She demanded to speak to the hotel manager, claiming she was a premier platinum guest and that this kind of disruption was entirely unacceptable. One of the tactical agents actually laughed at her ridiculous sense of entitlement, telling her that her hotel status did not exempt her from federal conspiracy laws. Sienna tried to quietly slip out the open boardroom door while the agents were focused on Liam and Desmond. But a female agent stepped directly into her path and placed a firm, heavy hand on her shoulder. The agent looked at Sienna and calmly informed her that she was not going anywhere. The agent told Sienna that her name was listed as a primary co-conspirator on the fraudulent Delaware Shell Company and that she was officially being detained for questioning regarding the laundering of illicit offshore funds. Sienna let out a blood-curdling shriek and tried to fight the agent, swinging her designer handbag wildly in the air. Two more officers quickly grabbed her arms and placed her in handcuffs, dragging her kicking and screaming to the center of the room next to her husband. The absolute destruction of their fake empire was unfolding live on my kitchen counter. Agent Miller walked over to the corner where my father had dropped his phone. The agent looked directly into the camera lens and gave a short, respectful nod, recognizing that I had provided the vital digital evidence to make this exact moment happen. He reached down and picked up the phone. The last thing I saw before the video feed completely cut to black was my father being pushed against the wall to be thoroughly searched, while my sister and her husband were marched out of the room in federal chains. 6 months have passed since that chaotic morning in the Miami boardroom. The bright summer sun was shining down on a quiet, secluded lake miles away from the noise of the city. I sat on a wooden dock, letting my bare feet dangle just above the cool, clear water. Grandpa Elijah sat in a comfortable folding chair right next to me, holding his fishing rod with a peaceful, content smile on his face. The air smelled like fresh pine trees and warm earth. The aftermath of the federal raid had been exactly as devastating as I predicted. Liam pleaded guilty to multiple counts of federal wire fraud and was currently serving a 15-year sentence in a minimum security federal prison. Sienna narrowly avoided jail time by turning state evidence against her own husband, but she was left completely bankrupt and saddled with massive unpayable legal debts. My parents, Desmond and Valerie, lost absolutely everything they claimed to value. Without the illusion of my grandfather's wealth to protect them, their angry creditors finally closed in. Their luxury cars were aggressively repossessed, their country club memberships were publicly revoked, and their sprawling colonial home was seized by the bank. They now live in a cramped two-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of the city, refusing to speak to each other and blaming everyone else for their complete downfall. As I watched the fishing bobber float gently on the calm water, I realized that I did not feel any anger or bitterness toward them anymore. I had spent my entire life trying to earn a place at a table where I was never truly wanted. I had allowed them to define my worth based on their own toxic and incredibly shallow metrics. But standing up to them and protecting my grandfather had shown me exactly who I really am. True family is not determined by shared genetics or a common last name. True family is defined by the people who consistently show up for you, who protect you in the dark, and who respect your boundaries and your spirit. Grandpa Elijah reeled in his empty line and laughed a deep, joyful sound that echoed across the quiet water. He told me he was proud of the woman I had become, and that his legacy was finally in the right hands. I smiled and leaned my head on his shoulder, feeling a profound sense of total freedom. Have you ever had to stand up to toxic family members who tried to use you for their own selfish gain? How did you find the courage to walk away and build a life you actually deserve? I would love to read your stories in the comments below. If my journey resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories about resilience and overcoming toxic families. Share this video with anyone who might need a reminder that walking away from toxic people is the first step toward finding your true peace. Thank you so much for watching, and remember that your worth is never determined by the people who are too blind to see it.